Let's get started. Story number 1.
The rain had started early that evening, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The five of us, Mia, Josh, Emma, Taylor, and me, were huddled in Mia's basement for a sleepover. Her parents had gone to her aunt's house for the night, leaving us with strict instructions not to leave the house. The power had flickered a couple of times but held steady, casting long shadows from the single overhead light that buzzed faintly. It was the perfect setting for a ghost story. We had exhausted all other activities, movies, snacks, even a brief pillow fight. When the suggestion of telling scary stories came up, we all jumped at the idea. What better way to spend a stormy night? "All right, I've got one," Josh said, leaning forward. He had a knack for storytelling, his voice low and dramatic. "It's about this house, this very neighborhood." Mia groaned. "Oh, come on, Josh, at least try to be original." "No, I'm serious," Josh insisted. "You've heard of the Grayson family, right? The ones who lived here before you guys?" Mia hesitated. "Yeah, kind of. My parents said they moved out because of some family emergency." Josh smirked. "That's not the whole story." The room fell silent. Even Emma, who usually dismissed ghost stories as nonsense, leaned in slightly. The basement felt colder, though I couldn't tell if it was the storm outside or the tension in the air. "They didn't move out," Josh continued. "They vanished. One night they were here, and the next, the whole family was just gone. People say their little girl, Lily, was seen walking down the street at midnight the night they disappeared, holding a doll. But when neighbors tried to talk to her, she'd vanish into thin air." "Lily?" Taylor repeated, her voice uncertain. Josh nodded. "The story goes, she died first. The parents didn't know she was playing near the basement stairs. She fell, broke her neck. They buried her in the backyard because they were too scared to report it. And ever since, anyone who spends too much time in this house," he paused dramatically, letting the sentence hang in the air, "ends up disappearing too." The room was silent, except for the sound of rain. Mia rolled her eyes. "That's such garbage, Josh." "Is it?" Josh challenged. "Have you ever been in your backyard after midnight? Or gone into the attic? People say that's where you can still hear her crying." Mia opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, the lights flickered and went out. The basement plunged into darkness, and someone screamed. Emma, I think. For a moment, the only sounds were the rain pounding harder against the windows and our hurried breathing. "Calm down," Mia said, though her voice wavered. "It's probably just the storm. I'll get a flashlight." She felt her way toward the stairs, her footsteps soft against the carpet. The rest of us stayed frozen, straining to hear anything over the rain and occasional rumble of thunder. "Did you hear that?" Taylor whispered suddenly. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "That tapping." We all went silent, listening. There it was, a faint, irregular tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the basement, near an old wardrobe that Mia's family used for storage. My stomach twisted as I stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of the sound. "It's just water dripping," Josh said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's not water," Emma said. It's coming from inside the wardrobe." Nobody moved. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails against wood. "Mia," I called out, my voice shaking. "Where's that flashlight?" No response. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic now. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized Mia hadn't come back yet. "I'll go find her," Josh said, though he didn't sound eager. He stood and fumbled his way toward the stairs, his silhouette briefly visible as lightning flashed through the small basement window. We waited in tense silence. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, I thought maybe the power would come back on, and we'd all laugh about how ridiculous we'd been. But then the wardrobe creaked. It wasn't just the sound of old wood shifting. It was the distinct sound of the door opening. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. In the faint light from outside, I could just make out the outline of the wardrobe door, slightly ajar. Taylor grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Guys," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's something in there." The door creaked open further, and I saw it. Small, pale fingers gripping the edge of the door. My heart felt like it stopped as a figure emerged. She was small, no more than 8 or 9, wearing a white nightgown that looked yellowed with age. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands over her face. "Lily?" Taylor whimpered, backing away. The girl's head tilted slowly as if she were studying us. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. Then she stepped forward, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Where's Mia?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the stairs. Her face remained hidden behind her hair, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and empty, like a void. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. We moved as one, edging toward the stairs. The girl didn't move, but her presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. Just as we reached the stairs, a loud thud came from above us. It sounded like something heavy falling. "Mia!" Josh's voice echoed down the stairwell, but it was distant, strained. "Go!" I yelled, pushing Emma and Taylor ahead of me. We stumbled up the stairs, our breaths coming in short gasps. The main floor was just as dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. "Mia?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Josh?" No response. We stood in the hallway, the rain battering the windows and the house groaning as the wind howled. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I grabbed Emma's arm. "We need to leave." But before we could move, the footsteps stopped. A shadow appeared at the end of the hallway, and for a moment, I thought it was Mia or Josh. But then the lightning illuminated the figure, and my heart sank. It was her, Lily. She stood there, motionless, her face finally visible. Her eyes were hollow pits, her skin cracked and peeling like old porcelain. A twisted smile spread across her face, revealing blackened teeth. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. We ran. I don't remember how we made it out of the house, but the next thing I knew, we were standing in the pouring rain, gasping for air. Emma and Taylor were crying, and I could barely keep my legs from giving out. We never saw Mia or Josh again. When the police searched the house, they found no trace of them. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. The only thing out of place was the wardrobe in the basement, which was now empty and covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way out. We don't talk about that night anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping at my bedroom window, even when there's no wind or rain. And every time, I'm too afraid to look. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started as an ordinary sleepover at Katie's house. There were 4 of us. Katie, Emma, Rachel, and me. Katie's parents were out of town, leaving her older brother, Jake, in charge. We'd done this dozens of times before, watched movies, ate snacks, stayed up late, gossiping. But this time, something felt different. Katie's house was an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, one of those places with a history. She always said the creaks and groans were just the house settling, but they always seemed to come from just the wrong place at just the wrong time. That night, it was storming. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wind howled against the windows, making the house seem even more alive. Around midnight, Katie suggested playing a game. "Let's do something spooky," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Emma groaned. "Not Bloody Mary or something dumb like that. I hate those games." No, not that," Katie said quickly. "Something more fun. My grandma told me about a game people used to play to talk to spirits. It's called the window knock." I glanced at Emma and Rachel. They looked just as uneasy as I felt, but none of us wanted to seem like the scared one. "How does it work?" Rachel asked hesitantly. Katie grinned. "Okay, we sit in front of a mirror with the lights off and one candle burning. We ask the spirits to knock on the window to answer yes or no questions." "That's creepy," Emma said, crossing her arms. Katie shrugged. "It's just a game. It's not real. Come on, it'll be fun." Despite our protests, Katie was already setting it up. She grabbed a small mirror from the hallway, a white candle from the kitchen, and a box of matches. She placed them in the middle of the living room and turned off the lights. The storm outside made the room even darker, the shadows stretching and swaying as Katie lit the candle. "Okay," she said, sitting cross-legged in front of the mirror. "Everyone hold hands." I reluctantly joined the circle, my palms already sweaty. The room was silent except for the distant rumble of thunder and the faint hum of the wind. The candle flickered, casting a strange glow on Katie's face. "Spirits of the house," Katie began, her voice low and dramatic. "If you're here, give us a sign." Nothing happened. The 4 of us sat in tense silence, waiting. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. Emma sighed. This is stupid. Can we? Before she could finish, there was a loud knock on the living room window. We all froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a light tap. It was deliberate, almost impatient. Did you hear that? Rachel whispered. Katie's grin faltered, but she quickly recovered. It's probably just Jake messing with us. Jake's upstairs, Emma said, her voice trembling. Katie hesitated, then shrugged. Maybe it was the wind. Let's keep going. I don't think this is a good idea, I said, glancing at the window. Don't chicken out now, Katie said, though her voice wasn't as confident as before. Spirits, Katie continued, her eyes on the mirror. Are you still here? Knock once for yes, twice for no. We waited, the room so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. Then, there it was, a single knock, sharp and clear. Emma gasped, yanking her hands away. I'm done. This isn't funny anymore. Katie rolled her eyes. It's just a game. Don't freak out. What if it's not? Rachel whispered, her face pale. Katie ignored her. Fine, I'll ask something else. Spirits, are you friendly? The room was silent for a moment. Then came 2 knocks. My stomach dropped. Okay, I'm done, Rachel said, standing up. This isn't fun anymore. Wait, Katie said, grabbing her arm. It's just getting good. Good? Emma snapped. It said it's not friendly, Katie. Before anyone could argue, the candle flickered violently, almost going out. The wind outside grew louder, and I thought I heard something else, a faint whisper, so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Hear what? Katie whisper, I said. It sounded like someone said something. Katie shook her head. You're imagining things. But then we all heard it, a low, raspy voice coming from the direction of the window. It was just one word, leave. Emma screamed, and we all jumped to our feet. Katie grabbed the candle, holding it like a weapon, as though the tiny flame could protect us. What was that? Rachel cried, her eyes darting around the room. I don't know, Katie admitted, her bravado finally cracking. We need to get out of here, Emma said, pulling at my arm. Katie hesitated, then nodded. Okay, let's go. We grabbed our things and ran for the door, but when Katie turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. It's locked, she said, panic rising in her voice. It wasn't locked before, Emma cried, pulling at the door. I'm telling you, it won't open. Katie said. The room grew colder, the air heavy and oppressive. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and unintelligible. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Upstairs, Rachel yelled. We can climb out a window. We ran upstairs, the floorboards creaking loudly beneath us. Katie led the way to her bedroom where she threw open the window. The rain poured in, but none of us cared. One by one, we climbed out onto the roof. The storm was in full force now, the wind howling and the rain stinging our skin. We scrambled down the trellis and ran to the street, not stopping until we were several houses away. We huddled under a neighbor's porch, soaked and shivering. Katie called Jake, who came to get us. When he went back to the house to check, he said everything was as we'd left it, except the mirror. It was cracked, a single jagged line running down the center. None of us ever talked about that night again. Katie's family moved a few months later, and we all lost touch, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the voice and the knocking, and I wonder, if we hadn't left, what would have happened?
Story number 3.
The 4 of us, Megan, Rachel, Lisa, and I, had been planning the sleepover for weeks. Megan's house was the obvious choice, mostly because it was massive and a little creepy. It was one of those older Victorian-style homes that creaked even when no one was walking. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, which meant we could stay up late, eat junk food, and scare ourselves silly without any adult interference. The night started innocently enough. We set up sleeping bags in the living room, surrounded by bowls of chips and candy. Rachel suggested we watch a scary movie, but Lisa vetoed it, claiming she didn't want to be scared before bed. Rachel rolled her eyes relented, and instead, we spent the next hour swapping urban legends and ghost stories. It was around midnight when Megan brought up the story of the basement. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and we all leaned in closer. You know this house is haunted, right? She said, her tone playful but with a hint of seriousness. Rachel snorted. Every old house is haunted if you listen to enough stories. No, I mean it, Megan insisted. The last owners moved out because of it. They said weird stuff kept happening, doors slamming, lights flickering, but the creepiest thing was the basement. Lisa visibly stiffened. What about the basement? They said they heard knocking, Megan continued. Not random creaks or noises, actual knocking, like someone was trapped down there. But whenever they checked, there was no one there. I laughed nervously. Come on, that's just a story. Is it? Megan said, raising an eyebrow. You've seen how weird this house is. The basement is the worst. Even my parents won't go down there unless they absolutely have to. Rachel leaned back against her pillow, smirking. Prove it. Let's go check it out. No way, Lisa said immediately, hugging her knees to her chest. Megan hesitated. I don't know. Oh, come on, Rachel said, standing up. It's probably just a dusty old room with spiders. Let's go, unless you're scared. Megan shot her a glare, but didn't back down. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Lisa groaned as the rest of us got up, but she reluctantly followed. Megan led the way, flashlight in hand, and we crept through the darkened house toward the basement door. The air felt colder as we approached, and I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination or if something really felt off. Megan paused at the door. Ready? Rachel nodded. Ready as I'll ever be. Megan opened the door and a cold draft hit us, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. The narrow staircase descended into darkness, and even with the flashlight, the bottom was barely visible. Maybe we shouldn't, Lisa said quietly, her voice trembling. We're just looking, Rachel said, starting down the steps. No big deal. One by one, we followed her, the wooden stairs creaking under our weight. The basement was unfinished, with cement walls and a dirt floor. Old shelves lined one side, cluttered with dusty jars and tools. The air was heavy, and the silence was almost oppressive. See? Rachel said, shining her phone flashlight around. Just a basement. Nothing scary here. But Megan didn't look convinced. She pointed her flashlight toward the far corner where an old rusted furnace loomed. That's where they said the knocking came from. Creepy, I muttered, my stomach twisting. Rachel walked toward the furnace, clearly trying to prove she wasn't scared. It's just an old furnace, probably makes weird noises because it's falling apart. As if in response, a soft knock echoed through the basement. We all froze. Did you hear that? Lisa whispered, clutching my arm. It's probably the pipes, Rachel said, but her voice was shaking. The knock came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably coming from the furnace. Megan took a step back, her face pale. I told you. Rachel hesitated, then stepped closer to the furnace. Hello? She called out, her voice wavering. Is someone there? For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the furnace door creaked open. Inside, it was pitch black, but the air seemed to grow colder and a foul metallic smell wafted out. Let's go, I said, grabbing Megan's arm. Now. Rachel took a step back, her bravado gone. Yeah, good idea. We turned to head up the stairs, but before we could take more than a few steps, the basement door slammed shut. Lisa screamed, and we all ran to the door, pounding on it and yelling. But no matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. What's happening? Lisa cried, tears streaming down her face. Megan's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, but the light barely seemed to penetrate the heavy blackness around us. And then we heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the dirt floor. It was coming from the corner, near the furnace. I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and skeletal, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow sockets, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It moved slowly, deliberately, its bony fingers reaching out toward us. Lisa sobbed, and Megan was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. What do we do? Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Run, I said, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the stairs. We scrambled up, pounding on the door again, but the figure was getting closer. Its footsteps were heavier now, echoing in the small space. Desperation clawed at my chest as I threw my weight against the door. Finally, with a deafening crack, it burst open and we tumbled out into the hallway. We didn't stop running until we were back in the living room, slamming the door behind us. The house was eerily silent, the storm outside having quieted to a faint drizzle. None of us spoke for a long time, each of us trying to process what had just happened. The rest of the night was a blur. We stayed in the living room, huddled together, too scared to sleep. When morning finally came, we went back to the basement to convince ourselves it had all been a bad dream. But the furnace door was still open, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. None of us ever spent the night at Megan's house again. And sometimes late at night, I think I can still hear that soft, deliberate knocking coming from somewhere deep beneath the ground. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The night had been set for a perfect sleepover. A few friends, some movies, snacks, and plenty of stories. My house had always been a bit on the older side, built in the 1920s, and although it was well maintained, there was something about it that gave off a strange vibe, especially at night. But on this particular evening, it wasn't the house itself that felt off. It was the presence of something else, something we couldn't quite explain. There were 4 of us: me, Katie, Sarah, and Emily. We had been planning this sleepover for weeks, and after a long day of school, we were ready for a night of fun. My parents were out, and the house was entirely ours. We settled into the living room, turning off the lights except for the fairy lights hanging across the walls, which gave the room a cozy, festive feeling. We started by watching a horror movie, one of those cheesy slasher films that no one really takes seriously. But as the movie dragged on, Katie, who had always been the brave one in the group, suggested something else. "Let's play a game," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Something a little more intense." We all looked at her, puzzled. "Like what?" I asked. "A séance," she said nonchalantly, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. "What? No way," Sarah immediately said, shaking her head. "That's way too creepy." "Yeah, especially in this house," Emily added, looking around as if the walls might suddenly come alive. But Katie wouldn't let it go. She had always been the type to push boundaries, and after a few minutes of convincing, we finally agreed. At worst, it would be a silly game, right? Katie rummaged through her bag and pulled out a small, round glass jar. "This is what we'll use," she said. "It's a spirit jar. Supposedly, it can channel spirits." None of us were convinced, but we went along with it. We all sat in a circle on the floor, the jar in the middle of us. Katie instructed us to place our fingers lightly on the jar, and we did, though I could feel a growing sense of unease settling in. "Let's ask the spirit to communicate with us," Katie said in a soft voice, a strange seriousness in her tone. "We're here to make contact. If you're here, show us a sign." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the air heavy with tension. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. We were about to give up, laughing off the ridiculousness of it all, when the jar suddenly jerked under our fingers, sliding several inches across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. That wasn't me," I stammered. None of us moved. The jar was still there, sitting in the middle of our circle, but something about it felt wrong. It felt like something was watching us. Katie, who had been the most eager to start the séance, now looked unsure. "Maybe we should stop." "No," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't stop now. What if we really made contact?" I wanted to leave. The atmosphere was suffocating, and I felt like there was something in the room with us, pressing down on us. But before I could voice my concerns, we heard a soft sound, like a tap on the wooden floor. It was faint, but clear. 3 taps, followed by a pause. Then another tap, and another. I could feel my skin crawl. My heart was racing now. "Did you hear that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale. The room was dead silent except for the tapping, which had become more rhythmic, as though someone or something was tapping on the floor beneath us. "Who's doing that?" I asked, but no one answered. We all stared at each other, unsure whether to laugh it off or run screaming. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. It wasn't the usual flickering of a light bulb malfunctioning. It was as if the whole house had momentarily lost power, only to return just quickly. The tapping stopped. We sat there in stunned silence. The air around us was colder now, colder than it should have been, even though the house's heating system had been running fine all night. "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Katie was the first to move. She stood up, taking a step back from the jar. "I think we should stop. This is not fun anymore." But as soon as she moved, the jar slid again, this time with a force that made it topple over. It rolled a few feet away, and for a moment there was nothing, just the sound of our breathing and the eerie silence. Then came the whisper. It was soft, So soft that at first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, coming from behind me. Leave. My body went rigid. It felt as though the words had been spoken directly into my ear, though no one was near me. I spun around, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was no one. Just darkness. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. The others nodded, but no one said anything. It wasn't the kind of whisper you could ignore. It was cold, commanding, and it wasn't done. The lights flickered again, this time longer, and in that brief flash of light, I saw someone standing in the corner of the room. It was a figure, pale and almost translucent, with hollow eyes staring directly at me. I screamed. The others screamed. We all scrambled to our feet, running toward the door, but it was locked. The door to the living room, the door to the kitchen, everything was locked, even though we had all been inside just moments before. Frantic, we pounded on the doors, begging for them to open, but they didn't. And that's when we heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the corners of the room. "Get out," the whisper came again, this time clear as day. "Now." None of us hesitated. We rushed to the window, throwing it open, and climbed out into the yard. We didn't stop running until we were in the street, panting and out of breath, looking back at the house. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. We didn't talk about it much after that night. The sleepover was never finished, and over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching me. The house was quiet again, but I knew it wasn't empty. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was a Friday night in October, and the air had the crisp bite of autumn. My best friend, Lisa, was hosting a sleepover at her house. There were just 4 of us: Lisa, her younger sister Megan, our friend Chloe, and me. We'd planned the usual, a scary movie marathon, junk food, and hours of gossip. Lisa's house was an old colonial on the edge of town. Her family had moved there a few years ago, and I'd always found the place a little unsettling. The rooms were large and drafty, and the old wooden floors creaked with every step. Lisa loved to tell us that the house was haunted, but I always thought she was just trying to freak us out. That night, after stuffing ourselves with popcorn and candy, we decided to watch a horror movie. Lisa picked an old classic about a haunted house, which felt appropriate given the setting. Megan, who was only 13 and easily spooked, kept peeking out from under a blanket. Chloe and I laughed at her, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the movie somehow mirrored the atmosphere of Lisa's house a little too well. Around midnight, the movie ended, and Lisa turned off the TV. The room fell silent, save for the faint whistling of the wind outside. Lisa's parents were out for the evening, and the house felt unusually quiet. "Let's do something scary," Lisa suggested, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Like a seance." "No way," Megan said immediately, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "That stuff is creepy." "Come on," Lisa said, grinning. "It's just for fun. Besides, nothing's going to happen." Chloe shrugged. "I'm in. Why not?" I hesitated, glancing at Megan. "I don't know, Lisa. Maybe we shouldn't mess with that kind of thing." Lisa waved me off. "It's just a game, Ellie. Don't be such a chicken." Before I could argue further, Lisa ran to grab some candles. She set them up in a circle on the living room floor and turned off the lights. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more ominous. "Okay," Lisa said, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "Everyone hold hands." Reluctantly, we joined her, forming a circle around the candles. Megan's hand was cold and clammy in mine, and I could feel her trembling. Lisa cleared her throat. "Spirits of this house, if you're here, give us a sign." We waited in silence, the room so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Nothing happened. "See?" Megan said, her voice shaky. "Nothing. Can we stop now?" But Lisa ignored her. "Spirits, we invite you to join us. If you're here, make yourself known." As soon as she finished speaking, there was a faint creak from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. Chloe laughed nervously. "It's just the house settling," she said, but her voice lacked confidence. Lisa grinned. "Maybe. Or maybe the spirits are answering." "Stop it, Lisa," Megan whispered. "This isn't funny." Lisa leaned forward, her voice lowering to a dramatic whisper. "Spirits, if you want to communicate, give us another sign." At that moment, the flames of the candles flickered violently, as if a gust of wind had blown through the room, but the windows were closed and there was no draft. Megan let out a small cry, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Okay, that's enough," I said, pulling my hands away. "This isn't funny anymore." Lisa looked like she wanted to argue, but then we all heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. It sounded like someone gently knocking on a door. "Who's up there?" Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one," Lisa said. "My parents aren't home." Megan was already in tears, clutching my arm. "I want to leave," she whispered. Lisa stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's go check it out." "Are you crazy?" I asked. "What if it's, I don't know, someone breaking in?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "There's no one breaking in. It's probably just the wind or something. Don't be such a baby." Before I could stop her, she was heading toward the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Chloe followed reluctantly, and after a moment, I helped Megan to her feet and dragged her along. I didn't want to stay in the living room by ourselves. The stairs creaked loudly as we climbed to the second floor. The tapping noise had stopped, and the hallway was eerily silent. Lisa shone the flashlight down the long corridor, its beam illuminating the old wooden floor and the doors to the bedrooms. "Where did it come from?" Chloe whispered. Lisa shrugged. "Let's check my room." We followed her to her bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and Lisa pushed it open with a dramatic flourish. "See?" "Nothing," she said, sweeping the flashlight around the room. But then the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from the closet. "Nope, I'm done," Chloe said, backing out of the room. Lisa ignored her, walking toward the closet. "It's probably just the pipes or something," she said, though her voice sounded less sure. She reached for the closet door handle and paused, looking back at us. "Ready? Just open it," I snapped, wanting to get this over with. Lisa yanked the door open. The closet was empty, filled only with clothes and boxes. But as we stared, the tapping started again, this time from behind us. We spun around, but the hallway was empty. Megan was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Please, can we go back downstairs?" she begged. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's go." We hurried back to the living room, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The candles had burned lower, their flames casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could still feel the chill in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we sat there in silence trying to calm down, the tapping started again, this time from the living room window. The curtains were drawn, and none of us dared to move to open them. "What do we do?" Chloe whispered. Lisa swallowed hard. "I don't know." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Megan was sobbing now, burying her face in my shoulder. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. "Let's leave," I said, my voice firm. "Let's go to my house or something. Anywhere but here." Lisa nodded, finally looking scared. "Okay, let's go." We grabbed our shoes and jackets and bolted for the door, but as soon as Lisa turned the knob, the door wouldn't budge. She twisted and pulled, but it wouldn't open. "It's stuck," she cried. "Try the back door," Chloe said, her voice rising in panic. We ran to the kitchen, but the back door wouldn't open either. It was as if the house didn't want us to leave. The tapping started again, louder than ever, coming from all around us. Windows, walls, even the ceiling. Megan screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward the living room. "What do we do?" Chloe yelled over the noise. Lisa was frantic, looking around the room. Her eyes landed on the candles. "Blow them out!" she shouted. "Maybe that'll stop it." We rushed to the candles and blew them out one by one. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, from the darkness, we heard a whisper. "Get out." The front door creaked open on its own, and we didn't wait to question it. We ran, grabbing our shoes on the way out, and didn't stop until we were halfway down the block. That night, none of us slept. Lisa refused to go back into her house until her parents came home the next day. She never talked about what happened, and neither did the rest of us. But I still have nightmares about that whisper and the feeling that something was watching us, even as we ran out the door. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was the weekend of my best friend's birthday, and naturally we had planned a sleepover. Emma and I had been inseparable since grade school, and we were always up for spending hours together at her house, which was in the old part of town. Her family had lived in the same house for years, and while it had always been a cozy, comfortable place, there was something about it that I couldn't quite shake off, especially at night. The house had creaky floors, drafty windows, and an eerie silence after dark, like the walls were always holding their breath. But Emma never seemed bothered by it, so I learned to ignore the unsettling feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. This time, there was a new twist. Emma's older brother, James, had recently moved back in after his year abroad. He was a quiet guy, the kind who kept to himself, and while I was used to him being around, he didn't exactly make me feel at ease. Still, it was Emma's birthday, so I pushed my apprehension aside and focused on the fun. We'd planned for the usual: pizza, movies, and staying up way too late. Emma had even set up a mini haunted house in the basement, complete with dim lighting and spooky decorations. As we descended the stairs to the basement after dinner, I couldn't help but feel a chill in the air. The basement had always had a strange, musty smell, but tonight it felt even colder. Is it just me, or does it feel extra creepy down here? I asked, trying to make light of it. Emma shrugged. It's supposed to be creepy. That's the fun of it. She lit a few candles she'd placed around the room, and for a moment, the basement looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie. We were having a blast, playing games and telling ghost stories, when James unexpectedly walked down the stairs. He had a strange look on his face, one I couldn't quite place, but Emma didn't seem to notice. She was too busy laughing with me, her back to him. "Why are you guys down here?" James asked, his voice unusually sharp. I hadn't realized it, but his tone seemed almost suspicious. "Just hanging out," I said, trying to sound casual. He paused for a moment, studying us. Then, as if on a whim, he muttered something I couldn't quite hear and turned to leave. His footsteps echoed faintly as he ascended the stairs, but the door creaked open and closed so quietly that I thought maybe he'd just gone back upstairs. The night wore on, and we ended up sprawled on the basement floor watching a horror movie. We were getting pretty spooked, and I was starting to feel the air grow colder again. I pulled my blanket tighter around me and glanced around, half expecting to see a shadow move across the room. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a loud bang. Emma screamed, and I jumped up, my heart racing. We exchanged nervous glances. "What the hell?" I muttered. "It's probably just the wind." "No way," Emma said, her voice shaking. "The door doesn't slam like that unless someone's messing with it." I went to the door, hesitated for a moment, then opened it carefully. The hallway outside was pitch black. I stepped into the dark corridor, my heart pounding. "Hello, James," I called out, but there was no answer. I took a few steps forward, my shoes making soft thuds on the hardwood floor. Suddenly, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around quickly, but the hallway was empty. The unsettling feeling didn't leave, though. It only seemed to intensify. "Emma?" I called over my shoulder, but there was still no response. I turned back to the basement, feeling foolish for even checking. When I stepped back inside, Emma was sitting at the far corner of the room, her face pale. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" I said, sitting down beside her. It sounded like footsteps, upstairs, slow ones, like someone was walking around. She trailed off, staring at the stairs leading back up to the main floor. I could feel my throat tightening. We were both too spooked to say anything else. We sat in silence, only the sound of the movie's dialogue filling the room, but even that didn't seem to comfort us. "Let's go upstairs," I suggested after a long moment, unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we reached the main floor, we found the living room in disarray. It wasn't like that before. The cushions were out of place, and the rug was slightly askew. Emma and I exchanged confused glances. "I don't get it," she whispered, eyes wide. "I swear I left everything the way it was, and I was the last one in here before we went downstairs." I felt my pulse quicken. Something about the whole situation felt off. Just as we were about to turn back toward the kitchen, I heard it, the faint sound of breathing coming from behind the couch. We froze, eyes wide. "Emma," I said in a hushed voice, "do you hear that?" Emma nodded, her face white as a sheet. "I'm not going to look. I'm not looking." I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I backed away, trying to remain as quiet as possible. Suddenly, I heard a low, rasping voice, barely a whisper, but clear enough for me to understand. "Get out!" My blood ran cold, and I grabbed Emma's arm, yanking her toward the door. We didn't even think to turn off the lights. We just ran. We didn't stop until we were outside, breathless and terrified. The crisp night air hit my skin like a shock, and I couldn't help but shiver. "What the hell was that?" Emma gasped, her face contorted with fear. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But I don't think it was just a prank." "James?" she muttered under her breath. "It has to be James messing with us." I didn't respond right away. Something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't James at all. I could have sworn I heard the whisper from behind me, coming from a place where no one stood. After a few minutes, we decided to go back inside, but we didn't go to the living room or the basement. We stayed in Emma's room, locked the door, and stayed close together. The rest of the night passed in silence. We were too afraid to sleep, so we stayed awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The hours dragged by, and as dawn finally broke, the strange feeling began to subside. But the next morning, Emma and I weren't the only ones feeling strange. When we went downstairs to find breakfast, we noticed something odd. The living room was in the same disarray we had seen the night before. But now, it was as though the cushions had been moved back into their original places. The rug was aligned perfectly again. And then I saw it, on the coffee table, a note scribbled in messy handwriting. It read, "You shouldn't have come back." I turned to Emma. She looked as pale as I felt. We didn't stick around much longer after that. We grabbed our stuff and left, never really talking about what happened. We've both gone back to Emma's house a few times since, but never stayed the night again. And every time I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night was far from over.
Story number 7.
It was a chilly October evening when my friends and I decided to have a sleepover at my place. I had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, and although the house had a certain charm to it, it was also the kind of place that made you feel like something was off. The creaky floorboards, the way the wind whistled through the cracks, and the lingering smell of old wood made it feel like the house had secrets to hide. My friends, Jenna, Claire, and Lucy, were excited about the sleepover. They had heard rumors about my new place, but they didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. They were the type to laugh at ghost stories and brush off anything that seemed even slightly spooky. We spent the first few hours of the evening playing games, watching movies, and eating junk food. We had all settled into the living room, the glow from the TV screen casting an eerie light over the room. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows, but we were all too distracted to care. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. We had just finished a scary movie and were sitting around talking about random things. Claire, the most adventurous of us, suddenly brought up the idea of doing something fun. "What about a seance?" she suggested, a mischievous grin on her face. "It's Halloween weekend, and we're in an old house. What better time?" I immediately felt a shiver run down my spine. I had heard the stories about my house, how it was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of former residents, but I didn't think they were real. It was just local folklore, right? "I don't know, Claire," I began, but she wasn't having any of it. "Come on, it'll be fun, just for a few minutes. We can use a candle, some light incense, nothing too dramatic." Jenna and Lucy looked at each other a little unsure, but after a few moments of hesitation, they agreed. I wasn't sure what had come over me, but I found myself nodding along with them. I figured if nothing happened, it would just be a silly game to play. We gathered around the coffee table, Claire lighting a candle and placing it in the center. We sat cross-legged, hands resting on the table, the only sound in the room, the wind howling outside and the faint flicker of the candle's flame. "All right, let's just concentrate and ask if there's anyone here with us," Claire instructed, her voice almost a whisper. "If there is, let's see if they'll give us a sign." At first, nothing happened. The flame flickered a bit, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, but we all sat in silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The room felt colder, but I figured it was just the night air creeping in. Then the candle flame flickered again, this time much more violently. It wasn't like a gust of wind had caused it. It was as if something had disturbed it, like a heavy breath had blown against the candle. I instinctively looked toward the others, but their faces were just as confused as mine. "Did you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. "It's freezing in here." We all nodded. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the air. The silence in the room was thick, almost oppressive, and the air itself seemed to be vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. "I think we should stop," I said, my voice barely audible. But before any of us could get up, we heard a soft sound, like a faint scratching noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the noise grew louder, closer. It was as though someone was dragging their fingers across the walls. We all froze. Claire, Jenna, and Lucy exchanged nervous glances, but none of us moved. The scratching sound was now unmistakable. It was right outside the living room door. I slowly got up to check, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could even reach the door, it creaked open on its own, as if an invisible hand had pushed it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I slowly peered into the hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light, and I could see the edges of the old wooden staircase leading up to the second floor, but there was nothing there. No one. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the wall, only this time it was louder, closer. I rushed back to the others, my heart in my throat. "Something's in the hallway," I whispered. "We need to get out of here." Claire, usually the brave one, was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "No way. This isn't a joke anymore. We need to leave. Now." We grabbed our things and rushed toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. "Let me out!" I yelled, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it still wouldn't move. "Stop!" Claire screamed. "There's something behind us!" I turned, my blood running cold. There, standing at the foot of the staircase, was a figure. A woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her long hair hanging in front of her face, obscuring her features. She stood motionless, staring at us with an unnatural stillness. I felt my legs turn to jelly. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, and I could hear the faintest whispering, like voices coming from nowhere. "Get away from the door," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to get out. We have to get out now." We backed away slowly, the woman's form still frozen at the foot of the stairs. I could feel my body shaking with fear, my heart pounding in my chest, but the door was still locked. The woman hadn't moved. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I felt a cold rush of air hit me from behind. The door swung open and I bolted out of the room, the others right behind me. We ran down the hallway and out the front door, not stopping until we reached the street. We didn't say anything as we walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I could still hear the whispers in my head, feel the cold presence of whatever it was that had been in my house. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. We didn't speak for days after that night. I didn't sleep for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the stairs, the way she had just stood there watching us. The house was never the same after that. The whispers, the cold drafts, the scratching noises, they all continued. And to this day, no matter how much I try to forget, I can still hear that woman's voice in the back of my mind, always just out of reach. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
It was a chilly Friday evening when my friends and I decided to have a sleepover at my place. I had recently moved into an old house on the edge of town, and although I loved the spacious rooms and the old world charm, there was something undeniably eerie about it. The house had a history of being abandoned for years, and when we moved in, I remember hearing from the neighbors that it had once belonged to an elderly woman who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. My friends, Hannah, Lily, and Sophie, were excited to come over for the sleepover. We'd been planning it for weeks. They all knew about the house's creepy reputation, but they insisted it would be fun. We started our night by watching a couple of horror movies, stuffing ourselves with pizza and snacks, and laughing at the ridiculousness of the films. As the night wore on, we began talking about ghost stories. It was just the sort of thing you do when you're at a sleepover, right? But the conversation took a strange turn when Sophie brought up the old woman who had once lived in my house. I heard she used to sit in the living room every night, just staring at the fireplace, Sophie said, her voice dropping lower. Some say she still haunts this place. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know much about the woman other than her name was Mrs. Walker, and she had been in her late 80s when she died. The house had been empty for about a year before my family moved in, and although I'd never seen or felt anything particularly unsettling, I couldn't deny the strange noises at night. Sometimes I would hear footsteps in the hall when no one was around or doors creaking open when I was sure I had locked them. "That's just a story," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You know how these things go." But Hannah wasn't so sure. She had always been sensitive to that kind of thing, and her eyes were wide as she looked around the room. "I don't know, Abby. I've been feeling weird about this place since we got here." We all grew quiet, and the air seemed to thicken with the weight of the conversation. The flickering light of the candles on the coffee table made the shadows dance along the walls, and for the first time that evening I felt the room grow colder. "I'm serious," Hannah continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I keep hearing things at night, like whispers." I laughed it off, but Sophie wasn't laughing. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Let's try something." I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "A seance." "No way," I said quickly. But Sophie was already pulling out a small silver coin she'd been carrying in her pocket. "It'll be fun," Sophie insisted. "We just need to ask if Mrs. Walker is here. If anything happens, we can stop." I glanced at Hannah and Lily, who both looked curious despite their nervousness. After a few moments, I reluctantly agreed. I didn't believe in this sort of thing, but the idea of scaring ourselves a little seemed harmless enough. We formed a circle around the coffee table, and Sophie placed the coin in the center. She told us to place our hands on the edge of the table and close our eyes. The house was completely silent now, and it felt like the world outside had stopped moving. "We're here to speak to Mrs. Walker," Sophie whispered. "If you're here, please show us a sign." The room grew even colder, and the air seemed to become heavy, like it was pressing down on us. For a moment, nothing happened. I was about to open my eyes and laugh at how ridiculous the situation was when Sophie gasped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I strained my ears, trying to listen over the sound of my own heartbeat. And then I heard it, a faint tapping, almost like a knock coming from the direction of the hallway. It was soft at first, then grew louder, as though someone was knocking on a door. We all froze, our hands still on the table. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Lily looked terrified, her face pale in the dim candlelight. "Sophie, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't funny." But Sophie didn't move. She was staring at the hallway with wide eyes. "It's not me, I swear." The tapping continued, louder now, and then it stopped. Silence fell over the room, and for a moment I thought my heart might explode from how fast it was beating. "Maybe it's just the house settling," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You know how old houses are." But none of us believed that. We all heard it, and the longer we sat there, the more uncomfortable the silence became. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "Let's just go to bed," I suggested, eager to change the subject. "We can deal with this in the morning." But as we stood up, the door to the hallway slammed shut with such force that it rattled the walls. I screamed, and everyone else jumped back. We rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door was stuck, as if something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. "Oh my God, Abby!" Lily cried, backing away from the door. "What's going on?" I didn't know. The air felt suffocating, and my heart was pounding in my ears. We were trapped. I reached for my phone to call my parents, but the battery was dead. It had been fully charged earlier that evening. I turned to the others, my mind racing. "We have to get out of here. We can't stay in this room." We moved to the window, but it was locked, and the curtains were tightly drawn. The only light came from the candles on the table, which flickered and sputtered in the thickening air. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the light. A woman, tall and thin, with long white hair. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, and her face was obscured by the darkness. I could see her staring at us, unmoving, and the air around her seemed to pulse with a cold, unnatural energy. "She's here," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could react, the room grew even colder and the candles flickered out. We were plunged into darkness. I could hear our frantic breathing, the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but the air around her seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly force. "We have to leave," I gasped. "We need to get out now." But as we turned to the door, it swung open on its own. We didn't hesitate. We ran down the hallway and out the front door, not stopping until we were across the street, panting and terrified. We didn't look back at the house. I knew that something had followed us, something that didn't belong there. The next morning, I went back to the house with my parents, but everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, the door was working fine, and there was no sign of anything strange. But I knew what we had experienced wasn't a trick. Whatever had been in that house wasn't gone. I haven't been back inside that house since. Every time I pass by, I feel a cold chill, and I know that whatever is still there is waiting for me, waiting for someone else to come inside. Story end.
Story number 9.
It was the summer of 2007, and I had been looking forward to Sarah's sleepover for weeks. She was my best friend, and we were both 14, the perfect age to have a sleepover full of gossip, junk food, and stories. Sarah lived in an old house at the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors, an overgrown backyard, and a history that had always made me feel uneasy. But I was used to it by then, having stayed over at her place countless times. The house was big, her family loved it, and I never let myself think too much about the oddities that came with it. This time, though, it felt different. The air was thick with a strange tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind as I walked up to Sarah's front door. She greeted me with her usual enthusiasm, and we went inside, the smell of popcorn and pizza filling the air. Her parents were out for the evening, which meant we had the house to ourselves. The night started like any other. We watched a scary movie, played Truth or Dare, and laughed about the stupidest things. But as the evening wore on, things started to get strange. Around midnight, Sarah suggested we go up to the attic. She'd always loved the attic, but I never could bring myself to spend much time up there. The wooden stairs creaked ominously every time we ascended, and the musty smell of old furniture filled the space when the door creaked open. Still, it was her sleepover, and I didn't want to seem like a scaredy cat. We climbed the stairs, and I immediately noticed the temperature drop. It was cold up there, far colder than it should have been for a summer night. We set up a few blankets on the floor and chatted for a while, but I kept glancing nervously at the corners of the attic. I couldn't help it. There was something off about the place. That's when we heard it. At first, it was just a soft creak, almost like the house settling. But then it was followed by a faint tapping sound, like someone was knocking on the attic window. I froze, looking at Sarah. She didn't seem bothered by it at first. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe even the house shifting. But then it came again, a louder tap like something, or someone was trying to get in. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart starting to race. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "I did. It's probably just the wind, though. It's an old house, remember?" But the tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent, until it almost sounded like it was coming from inside the attic itself. I stood up, my pulse thudding in my ears. "Sarah, I don't think that's the wind." She didn't respond immediately, but I saw her face go pale. "Maybe it's a bird or something," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. I hesitated, then moved cautiously toward the window. The attic was small and cramped with barely any furniture, so I had a clear view of the glass. There was nothing there. No bird, no tree branches tapping against the window. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill creep down my spine. "There's nothing outside." Sarah looked around nervously. "Okay, this is weird. Maybe we should go downstairs." I agreed, and we both began to gather our things. But before we could even leave, there was another sound. This time it wasn't tapping. It was the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate, like a heavy object being moved from one side of the attic to the other. We both froze. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I slowly turned my head toward the far corner of the attic, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. In the dim light, I thought I saw something shift, something dark, something that didn't belong. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "We need to get out of here." We ran down the stairs, our feet thudding against the wooden steps, and when we reached the bottom, I turned to look back up at the attic door. It was closed, but I swore I could still hear something, faint but persistent. The sound of something scratching like it was trying to break through. We bolted down the hall and into the living room, trying to catch our breath. My mind was racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I was certain something was wrong. "Do you think?" Sarah started, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said quickly, cutting her off, "but I don't want to find out." We huddled together on the couch, too scared to speak. I kept glancing at the stairs, half expecting something, or someone, to appear at the top. But nothing happened. The house was silent again, as if nothing had ever occurred. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. After what felt like hours, we heard the front door creak open. Sarah's parents had come home, and I felt a wave of relief. But when they entered the living room, they looked at us strangely. "What are you two doing awake at this hour?" Sarah's mom asked. "We were just, hanging out," Sarah mumbled, avoiding her gaze. But I saw something in her eyes, something I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of concern, maybe even fear. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach churn. The night dragged on in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and confusion. We eventually went to bed, but neither of us slept well. I kept hearing sounds, the creaks and groans of the house settling, but also the faintest tapping, as if it was still there, just beyond the walls. The next morning, I thought everything would feel normal again, but it didn't. The atmosphere in the house had changed. It was like the air was thicker, heavier, as if it was holding its breath. Sarah's parents were acting distant, especially her mom. I noticed that she kept glancing nervously at the attic door, as if she knew something we didn't. I didn't want to press the issue, but when I went to leave, I couldn't help but ask Sarah's mom, "Has anything strange ever happened in this house?" Her face paled. She looked like she was about to say something, but she stopped herself. "Just be careful in the attic, dear," she said quietly. "There are things you don't want to disturb." I was about to ask what she meant when Sarah rushed over and pulled me away. We said our goodbyes, and I left, my mind still spinning from the events of the night before. But as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, something that had been waiting for us to leave the attic. I don't know if it was just a figment of my imagination or if something truly was in that house, but I've never been able to forget that night. I never went back to Sarah's house for a sleepover again, and to this day, when I hear tapping or dragging sounds late at night, I can't help but wonder if it's something that followed me from that attic. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I've always been a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural. I don't believe in things I can't see or touch, and I've always thought that those stories were just tricks of the mind, too easily dismissed. But one night, during a sleepover at my friend Rachel's house, I experienced something that I still can't explain. Something that changed the way I think about the world. Rachel and I had been friends for years, and we'd had countless sleepovers at her house. Her family lived in an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, a house with creaky floors, tall windows, and an attic that always seemed a little too dark and foreboding for my taste. The kind of house that felt like it had a history, even if it wasn't one I knew. This particular sleepover was set to be like any other: movie marathons, popcorn, and staying up late. I had no reason to think this night would be any different, but it was, in a way I couldn't have anticipated. We were lounging in Rachel's room, sprawled out on the floor with blankets, snacks, and our phones. The room was cozy, filled with the scent of lavender from the candles Rachel liked to burn. The usual chatter filled the air as we talked about boys, school, and life in general. The window was cracked open, and a cool breeze drifted in, rustling the curtains softly. Around midnight, we decided it was time for one of our infamous ghost story sessions. Rachel had an entire collection of books filled with creepy stories and urban legends, and we had a tradition of scaring each other with them. After reading a particularly unsettling story about a haunted house, we both decided to call it a night and head to bed. But as we were getting settled, something strange happened. Rachel's house, like many old homes, had an odd, creaking sound whenever you walked around. The floorboards groaned with every step, especially in the hallway outside her room. But that night, something else caught my attention. Something I couldn't quite explain. As Rachel was turning off the light and climbing into bed, I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't clear, but I could hear it, coming from somewhere deep in the hallway, just beyond the door to Rachel's room. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the whisper came again, this time a little clearer. It sounded like a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakably there. It was a low murmur, too quiet to make out, but it felt as though it was speaking directly to me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaky as I looked at Rachel. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "What?" she asked. "There was someone talking," I said, my heart beginning to race. Rachel looked at me with a mix of confusion and amusement. "It's probably just the wind or the house. It's old, remember?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but it was just the darkness of the hallway stretching beyond the threshold. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. "Let's just go to sleep," Rachel said, clearly trying to dismiss my growing discomfort. She flipped over to her side and pulled the blanket over her head, muttering something about needing rest. But I couldn't relax. The whispering kept coming, growing louder, as though it was getting closer to the door. I tried to close my eyes to drown out the sounds, but the air in the room felt thick. The whispers became more distinct now, no longer a distant murmur, but a voice I could almost understand. I could feel it pressing against my ears, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to be saying my name. I froze. "Rachel?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond. She was already asleep, or so I thought. I had no idea what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of ghosts, spirits, anything that might explain the inexplicable. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, the result of too many late-night horror movies. But the whispers didn't stop. They continued, relentless and growing clearer, until I could hear what they were saying. "Help! Help me!" My heart stopped. The voice was cold, desperate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like it was right outside the door, just beyond the threshold, begging for something, begging for help. Without thinking, I shot out of bed and opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty, still and quiet. The only sound was the soft creaking of the house. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the dark hallway with a sense of dread settling over me. There was nothing there, just the shadows and the silence. I turned back to Rachel's room, my legs shaking as I crossed the threshold and closed the door behind me. She was still asleep, the faint glow of her nightlight casting a dim light over her face. I felt stupid. Of course, there was nothing there. I had probably imagined it all. But then I heard it again. A soft rustle, like the sound of something moving in the hallway. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, slowly and deliberately. I looked back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the attic. The door at the far end of the hallway that was always locked, always off limits. The attic. I had always been told to stay away from the attic. Rachel's parents had never talked about it much, but there was an unspoken rule about not going up there. I didn't know why, but something about the place had always unsettled me. The creaking continued. The door to the attic was slowly inching open. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to do something, to run or hide or anything. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. I watched, paralyzed, as it slowly opened wider, revealing the pitch-black space beyond. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the creaking stopped. The door stood wide open, and the house fell into silence once again. I felt a rush of cold air as though something was standing in the doorway, just waiting for me to make a move. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as I stared at the attic entrance, too scared to look away. "Rachel," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but she didn't answer. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I walked toward the attic door, my hand trembling as I reached out to close it. Just as my fingers brushed the edge of the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness of the attic, my breath coming in short gasps. But eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I ran back to Rachel's room, slammed the door, and climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my head. That night, I didn't sleep. I just listened, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing. No whispers, no creaks, just the silence of the house. When I woke up in the morning, the attic door was closed again, as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was still there, waiting. I didn't tell Rachel what happened that night. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. But every time I've gone back to her house since, I can't help but glance nervously at the attic door. And every time, I swear I can hear the faintest whisper just at the edge of my hearing. Help, help me. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It was the summer before my junior year of high school when my best friend Emma invited me to a sleepover at her family's house. Emma's house was big, 2 stories, a sprawling yard, and an old wooden deck in the back. It was the kind of house that looked like it had a history, but Emma had always shrugged it off when I asked about it. She'd lived there her whole life and never seemed to mind the creaky floors or the strange cold spots in the hallway. That night, we were joined by 2 other girls, Katie and Olivia. We had spent most of the evening watching movies, painting our nails, and gossiping about everything and anything. It was the usual teenage girl sleepover stuff. But things took a turn when we decided to play a game of truth or dare just before midnight. Emma, who was always the one to push us into doing something a little bit daring, suggested that we do something different. What if we try a seance? She said with a smirk, clearly knowing it would freak us out. At first, everyone laughed it off, but then Emma's face became serious. I mean it. There's this old story about a woman who used to live here. I think her name was Mrs. Gray. I've read about her in some of the journals my parents have. They say she died in the house a long time ago. Some people think she never left. Now, I had always thought Emma's house had a weird vibe, but I was skeptical about ghosts. But the idea of trying something that might actually give us a scare was too tempting. After some convincing, the 4 of us agreed. We set the scene in the living room, dimmed lights, candles flickering on the coffee table, the air thick with anticipation. We sat in a circle, hands resting on the floor, our legs crossed beneath us. Emma placed a small glass tumbler in the middle, and we all placed our fingers lightly on it. Mrs. Gray, Emma said in a whisper, "If you're here, show us a sign." The room fell completely silent. I could hear the wind rustling outside, the occasional creak of the house settling, but nothing else. I glanced at the others. Katie was nervously biting her lip, Olivia's eyes were wide, and Emma seemed to be concentrating. Seconds felt like minutes. Then something strange happened. The glass in the center of our circle shifted, just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me jump. Katie gasped, "Did you see that?" We all nodded, too frightened to speak. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the sensation in the room. It was colder now, and I swear I could feel a pressure on my chest, like something was watching us. Emma's eyes locked onto mine, her face pale. "We have to ask again," she whispered. "Mrs. Gray, are you here?" Before anyone could respond, the glass suddenly moved again. This time it slid across the floor, leaving a streak of condensation on the wood. Everyone jumped to their feet, gasping. I couldn't breathe. "I think we should stop," I said, my voice shaking. Emma hesitated, but she nodded. Okay, let's end it." We blew out the candles and the room was plunged into darkness, but the cold lingered and the air felt heavy. We sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Suddenly, we heard a faint sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. "I think someone's upstairs," Katie whispered. "Maybe it's just my parents," Emma said, her voice tight. But I could hear the unease in her tone. I got up, slowly walking toward the hallway. I glanced at Emma, who was still sitting on the floor, her face pale. "Emma, who's upstairs?" She swallowed hard. "No one," she said, her voice barely audible. "No one's been up there in hours." I crept toward the stairs, my footsteps muffled against the carpet. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My heart was pounding now, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for the way things were starting to feel. I slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by a single light at the far end. There were 3 doors in the hall, all closed. No sign of anyone. But as I reached the first door on the left, I heard a faint voice. It was soft, like a whisper, but unmistakable. "Get out." I froze. My blood ran cold. The voice was clear, too clear to ignore. It was coming from behind the door. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark room beyond. I could barely make out the shape of an old wooden rocking chair in the corner, its seat facing away from the door. The air in the room was thick, the temperature so cold I could feel it biting at my skin. "Emma?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is this?" There was no answer. I turned to go back down the stairs when I heard the door slam shut behind me. My heart raced as I turned to face the door, which was now shut tight. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was in that room, something not quite human. Suddenly, I heard the soft whisper again. This time it was clearer. "Leave now." I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. The other girls were waiting in the living room, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "Abby," Emma gasped, rushing to my side. "What happened?" "There's something up there, in the room," I said, panting. I heard a voice. Katie, who had always been the skeptic, looked nervous. "What do you mean, a voice?" Something, told me to leave." I was shaking now, unable to control it. I could still feel the presence up there, pressing down on me. Emma's face went ashen. "I've heard that before." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice a whisper. She looked at the others, then back at me. "My parents, they've told me stories about the house, about Mrs. Gray." I stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Emma took a deep breath. "I don't know the whole story, but Mrs. Gray was a widow who lived here for years. She had a son, but he died when he was young. They say she was never the same after that. She would sit in that room, in the rocking chair, staring out the window. I think she never left." My skin crawled as I realized that what I had felt, wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. Something was in this house, and it wasn't willing to let us forget. We didn't speak much after that. We packed our things quickly, our voices hushed and our nerves on edge. No one wanted to be the first to leave, but none of us wanted to stay any longer. The house felt alive with an oppressive energy that none of us could deny. We left without another word, walking down the street as quickly as we could, each of us glancing back at the house. Emma never spoke about Mrs. Gray again, and I never asked. But I still think about that night, about the whisper, the cold, and the feeling that something was watching us. I haven't been back to Emma's house since, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. Ghost stories? All just tall tales and overactive imaginations, I thought. But that belief changed the night I stayed over at my best friend Amy's house. Amy lived in an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. The kind of house with creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a history that made it seem most otherworldly. Her parents had bought the house when we were younger, and she'd always told me stories about it. Apparently, the house had been around for over a century, and rumors had circulated about strange occurrences in the past. People talked about the previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lancaster, who had passed away mysteriously under unsettling circumstances. But Amy's family never believed in those stories. To them, the house was just old, not haunted. I had spent plenty of time at Amy's house before, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. There were the usual creaks of the house settling, the groans of the pipes, and the occasional draft that would sneak in through the old windows. But on that particular Friday night in October, something changed. Amy invited me to stay over for a sleepover. We had planned on watching movies, eating junk food, and talking about boys, just like we always did. Little did I know, this sleepover would be unlike any other. It started out like any normal evening. We watched scary movies, ate an absurd amount of candy, and shared the usual gossip. As the night wore on, we found ourselves in the living room, sitting on the couch playing a game of truth or dare. We had moved into the living room because the upstairs seemed too quiet and eerie, especially the guest bedroom where I usually stayed. The attic was above that room, and I had always felt a strange heaviness when I was near it. Amy's parents were out for the evening, so it was just the two of us. Amy's younger brother, Luke, was staying at a friend's house, and we had the entire place to ourselves. Around midnight, things took a strange turn. We decided to tell ghost stories, a sleepover tradition. Amy pulled out an old book from her shelf, one that her parents had warned her never to read because it was filled with the stories of the house's past. It was an old, dusty book with yellowed pages, and the cover had a faded image of Mrs. Lancaster. I hadn't paid much attention to the book in the past, but tonight, curiosity got the better of me. Amy began reading from it, her voice low and dramatic as she recited a story about the house's former owner. Mrs. Lancaster, she said, was rumored to have never left her home. Some say her spirit still roams the halls, waiting for someone to set her free. But others believe her spirit is cursed, and anyone who tries to help her ends up falling victim to her rage. I tried to brush it off as just another creepy story, but something about the way Amy's voice trembled as she spoke unnerved me. The room seemed colder somehow, and I noticed the shadows around us growing deeper as she read. I laughed nervously. It's just a story, right? I mean, it's just a book. There's no way. Amy smiled, but didn't seem as convinced. I don't know. I always get this weird feeling when I read from it, like someone is watching me. She paused, glancing around the room. I don't like to read this book alone. I shrugged, trying to sound brave. I'm sure it's just your imagination. We're safe. But even as I said those words, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my stomach. We turned off the lights and decided to go upstairs to bed, laughing about how creepy the house was as we made our way to Amy's room. I had stayed there a dozen times before, but tonight, everything felt different. The air was thick with a kind of tension, and as we reached the top of the stairs, I felt my heart race. Let's just get some sleep, I said, trying to sound confident, though I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I walked into the room. We both crawled into bed, pulling the covers up around us, trying to push away the lingering fear that had settled in. Amy turned off the lamp beside the bed, and the room fell into darkness. For a while, we just lay there in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs, echoing through the house. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, and I could hear the distant howl of a dog in the distance. The usual noises of the house, the creaks and groans, felt louder somehow. I kept hearing soft tapping noises from somewhere above, though I knew the attic was completely sealed off. The sound didn't make sense. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Amy didn't answer right away. She was still awake, I could tell. "Yeah, what was that?" I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The tapping grew louder, and I realized that it wasn't just the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps that were moving across the attic. The attic was a place that no one ever went. It was too dark, too cold, and too locked away for anyone to bother with. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the ceiling, my breath shallow. "Maybe it's just the house settling," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor echoed through the house. It was as if something or someone was moving up there. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the dark. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Amy whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't disagree with her. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with a presence I couldn't explain. I turned to Amy, my face pale in the dim light of the room, but she was staring at the door, her eyes wide with fear. I followed her gaze, and my heart skipped a beat. The door to the hallway was slowly opening. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the movement was deliberate, as if someone had pushed it open. The faint glow from the hallway spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. My body tensed, and I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I scream? Before I could act, we both heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice, soft but urgent, calling out from the darkness. "Help me. Help me." Amy's breath caught in her throat, and I saw the panic in her eyes. "What is that?" she gasped. I didn't have an answer. The voice sounded so real, so close, as if it were right in the room with us. The whispering continued, repeating the same words over and over again, growing louder, more desperate. "Help me, help me." I felt frozen, unable to move or speak. The footsteps above us continued, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. The presence was overwhelming, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on us. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The door to the hallway slammed shut on its own. The whispering ceased. The footsteps above went silent. For a long moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The silence was deafening. Amy finally broke the stillness. "We need to get out of here, right now." We didn't need any further encouragement. Without saying another word, we grabbed our things and ran down the stairs. We bolted out of the house into the cold night air, too scared to look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the nearest convenience store, where we sat huddled together in shock. We never went back to Amy's house after that night. Neither of us spoke of it again, but we both knew what we had experienced. I don't know what happened that night, but I've never been able to forget the whisper or the cold presence that lingered in the house. Every time I hear footsteps or feel a chill in the air, I can't help but think back to that sleepover. Some things, no matter how hard you try to explain them away, stay with you forever. Story the end.